Good afternoon and welcome to Inquirer Live. I'm Trudy Rubin, Worldview foreign affairs columnist for the Philadelphia Inquirer, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Delaware Democratic Senator Chris Coons. Senator Coons has served in the Senate since 2010, holding the seat that Joe Biden occupied before he became vice president. One of the fascinating aspects of Senator Coons' bio is that he graduated from both Yale Law School and Yale Divinity School simultaneously. So it's fitting that he is now chairman of the Senate Ethics Committee. He also has a deep and long interest in foreign policy, serving on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And he's a close confidant of President Biden, longtime confidant, and President Biden strongly considered him for Secretary of State and has already sent him on a special mission to Africa. Senator Coons has a keen interest in policy towards China, especially the critical competition with Beijing over the groundbreaking technologies that are going to define the 21st century. And he's also known for his longstanding efforts to promote bipartisanship on domestic and foreign issues, sometimes called Biden's emissary to the GOP. So the senator is perfectly placed to discuss President Biden's foreign policy 3 weeks after the 100-day mark of his presidency, whether there is indeed a Biden foreign policy doctrine, whether we're embarked on a new Cold War with China, and White House policy towards Russia and the Middle East. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping details so you'll know how to participate. Senator Coons can only be with us for about a half hour, so I'm going to organize things a bit differently than usual. Anytime during the discussion, you can submit questions by clicking on the black bar below that says comments and typing in your questions. If you are on social media, you can visit us on inquirer.com/Trudy Live to submit questions. I will try to work questions into my discussion with Senator Coons, since time is short, and hopefully leave time for one or two at the end on topics we've missed. So now we'll move forward to discussion with Senator Coons. Hi.
Hey, Trudy. Great to be on with you.
Good to see you, Senator. I'm really glad to have this opportunity. So since you've known President Biden for so long, could you talk a little bit about your relationship with him and conversations you've had on foreign policy and what you think shaped his foreign policy outlook? And also whether one can already discern a Biden foreign policy doctrine.
Well, thanks, Trudy. I first got to know then Senator Biden a little bit when I was an intern for the Senate Judiciary Committee when I was a law student. I got to know him well through observing him and supporting his work on the nominations unit of the Judiciary Committee, but I don't think he knew me very well. And then over that next decade, I was a Biden admirer and supporter. I had gone to Iowa in 1988. I went back to Iowa in 2008. When I first ran for office, it was for county council, which was the office he held before becoming a senator. I was close to his children. I got to know him and his core staff over a long period of time when he was a senator and I was a county councilman, county council president, and then county executive. And I was an enthusiastic supporter of his campaign in 2008, although it was relatively brief. I was one of the first senators, if not the first, to endorse him when he ran for president in 2020 and did a lot of campaigning around the country and doing press interviews on his behalf. His views on foreign policy were shaped profoundly by his 36 years in the Senate and his time on the Foreign Relations Committee, by in-person meetings with heads of state and foreign ministers, by visiting countries around the world, and by his 8 years of experience as President Obama's vice president. And I think if I were to try and summarize the short phrase, build back better, that has been applied to his view on infrastructure and on our economy and on the social fabric of our country, also frankly describes his view about foreign policy. The previous administration left him with a lot of strained relationships with our closest allies, difficulties in terms of our engagement with multilateral institutions or treaties or frameworks, and some real challenges in terms of ascendant and aggressive competitors around the world. And it's not enough to simply rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement or negotiate around possibly rejoining the JCPOA. It's not enough to just make a visit to Brussels and talk about NATO and its value, or receive the Prime Minister of Japan or the President of South Korea. To rebuild some of those vital alliances and structures isn't enough. So building back better in the foreign policy context means, I think, reinvesting in ourselves, in strengthening our democracy, in helping average Americans see themselves and see the benefit to them of our engagement with the world. President Trump didn't come out of nowhere. There was a long-standing, growing sense of grievance about globalization, American jobs being shipped overseas, American troops being stuck in overseas conflicts for decades that eroded some of the confidence, some of the consensus around our engagement with the world that had built up after the Second World War. We have to rebuild that engagement by middle-class Americans all over the country. We have to show that our democracy can work, and then we have a real chance at not just building back our place in the world, but building it back better, strengthening it, advancing it, and restoring our place of leadership in the world.
I want to talk about Biden's approach to China. Some people are saying that he is simply following in former President Trump's footsteps in taking a similarly hawkish approach to China. Some are saying that his doctrine is similar to the Truman doctrine, and that the U.S. needs an enemy in order to organize its foreign policy. So is President Biden's policy towards China, which is central to his foreign policy outlook, is that simply Trump 2.0?
That is so. That question strikes me as just profoundly missing the moment that we're in globally. I don't know of any serious senator who would disagree that China is our principal competitor in this century, and that the contest between the Chinese Communist Party and their authoritarian model for how the state relates to individuals, their actions in Xinjiang against the Uyghurs, their actions crushing democracy in Hong Kong, their efforts to export digital authoritarianism. To say that President Biden's approach to China is the same as President Trump's profoundly misses critical areas of difference, the most important of which is President Biden recognizes we have to have allies. We have to have a strong and close and robust network of allies who share our values in order for us to have any chance at restraining and successfully competing with a pure competitor in China. The first two heads of state President Biden welcomed to the White House were the Prime Minister of Japan and the President of South Korea. There's a reason for that. I'll remind you, President Trump spent his first couple of weeks as president calling up and offending the leaders of countries like Australia and Canada. President Trump used tariffs to try and impose costs on China, to be combative with China. And while I agreed with President Trump's assessment that China was stealing our inventions and innovations, and there needed to be a cost put to China's innovation mercantilism, I profoundly disagreed with the way he went about it. It was a club that he kept swinging around and hitting our closest allies with, distancing us from the Canadians, the Brits, the Europeans, the South Koreans, the Japanese, the Australians. So these are profoundly different strategies. They share in common a clear-eyed view that China is our principal competitor. And your reference to Truman and the idea that somehow we need an enemy to organize our nation, I don't see, frankly, how that applies. That suggests that we are ginning up China and projecting on China that it's more hostile than it really is just to have an enemy. I have to tell you, having spent 10 years on the Foreign Relations Committee, having been in capitals around the world, from Africa to South America to the Middle East and Europe, China is profoundly aggressive under Xi Jinping. They have taken a very different turn in the last few years. And we have different systems and different views of the world. My hope is that we will remain competitors, that we will avoid a direct and armed conflict. But the dream that many of us had for decades, that China would gradually become a more open and liberal and democratic society as it developed and as it advanced and as it had a middle class and as it engaged with the world, was clearly misguided. And senators of both parties have been saying in speeches in the last few months and years that we regret that China has taken a turn towards being far more aggressive and competitive. And if we're to avoid conflict, we're going to have to find ways to compete successfully, to cooperate and partner in a few critical areas like climate change and pandemics and nuclear proliferation, but to be prepared for conflict. China is pouring money into their military. They are building a blue water navy the same size as Great Britain's navy every year. And they have recently engaged in conflict throughout their region with their neighbors in the South China Sea, with India in Kashmir, with Bhutan, where they're literally sort of invading and taking over territory. And then again, in their own province in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs. I just find it hard to see how anyone could look at the record of China over the last decade and say that we are creating an enemy rather than they have become more aggressive.
Right. Now, in terms of the competition with China, you have talked a lot about the technological challenge. You focus on U.S.-China competition in cutting-edge technology, which Biden has called the fourth industrial revolution. And there's new bipartisan legislation, the Endless Frontier Act, I think the name has now changed, which seeks to pour $120 billion into jumpstarting scientific innovation to bolster our competition with China. Can you explain why this technological competition is so critical to the relationship?
Sure. Let me try to be concise if I can. China completely missed 3G and 4G, which were, sort of dramatic advances in digital communications. They had no intention of missing 5G. And some of their iconic companies like Huawei and ZTE were critical to their global competition to be a central player in 5G. In fact, Huawei, I'm sorry?
Just interject for those who don't know that this is the technology that provides the platform for the next generation of internet. 5G is what's on the horizon, then comes 6G. Excuse me for interrupting.
Correct. The fifth generation, or 5G, of interconnectivity is going to transform societies and business and industry around the world. And China, by using state subsidies for Huawei, has been very aggressive about building out the physical infrastructure of 4G and then the platform for 5G. And the United States has worked closely with many of our most trusted security partners to make it clear to them that Huawei has a way for the Chinese government to gather data and to benefit from and gain from, both from a security and national security and intelligence perspective and from a commercial and competitive perspective, their leading role. The United States didn't have a competitive offer. So when we went to countries like Australia or the United Kingdom and said, we are the closest intelligence and security partners, please do not let a Chinese platform and product into your most important networks. They said, great, fine. What do you have to offer? And we didn't have anything. We only had, Nokia and Ericsson and Samsung that are manufactured in democratic societies in Finland and Sweden and South Korea, but we didn't have an American offering. And those three didn't have cost competitive offerings. So that is one of a dozen examples I could give you, from semiconductors to quantum computing to 5G, where the United States has allowed its dominance in innovation and manufacturing of 20 or 30 years ago to gradually slip, and where China and other countries have filled that gap. So I am excited about the Endless Frontiers Act. We took a vote last Monday. It was a vote of 86 to 11 to proceed to that bill. It's been on the floor of the Senate this whole week. It is strongly bipartisan. In the Foreign Relations Committee, on which I serve, we advanced something called the Strategic Competition Act by a vote of 21-1. It was a genuinely bipartisan moment. That was a bill that looked at China as a competitor and looked at how we could invest in our development, USAID, and our State Department, how we could be more successful at engaging with our allies. Several bills are going to come together on the floor of the Senate this coming week. And I'm really excited about it. It shows that there is bipartisanship, that we can and will invest in our own innovation and our own manufacturing and supply chains. And I think it will, in the end, make us a more stronger, more capable competitor with China. And Trudy, in visiting with foreign heads of state and foreign ministers, having conversations virtually or in person in the last few months, I've been struck at how many of them have raised the riot at the Capitol on January 6th. And how profoundly that shook their confidence in the future of American democracy, to see an angry, armed mob marauding through our Capitol, threatening to hang the vice president. So we need to be focused and deliberate and urgent about our work to come together, to deliver bipartisan legislation, to show that our democracy can work and that we can invest in ourselves to be true competitors in this century.
Let me just follow up on 2 points that you just made. Firstly, in the technology race, what you're saying is that we have been lagging, and many experts say this is because R&D, research and development, has been dropping. So, in other words, critical to the competition with China is increasing R&D. And just briefly, I know that this bill that you've promoted, the Endless Frontier Act, would put money into developing R&D centers. Any chance one might be in Philadelphia?
That would be my hope. I was the co-author of a bill that would create regional innovation centers. You know, look, the overwhelming majority of venture capital, of new patents that are issued, of startup businesses that grow dramatically are concentrated in just a few places: Silicon Valley, Research Triangle in North Carolina, Boston, and the Route 128 a ring around Boston. Philadelphia and the greater Philadelphia area, which includes Delaware, is a prime target to be one of those sort of next ring of innovation hubs. We've got world-class universities, research institutions, hospitals. We're doing some great work in this immediate region. That is something I will be fighting for as we then move towards allocating some of the NSF money, some of the DOE money, some of the NIH money that will come out of this legislation if we're successful in getting it to President Biden.
Experts on health, on energy, and so forth. Is this the Sputnik moment that we have been waiting for, when Congress finally wakes up and we have an administration that is willing to look directly at this need to spur innovation on a scale that has been lacking really since we countered Sputnik with the Soviet Union?
Yes, and let me be clear about that for a moment, if I could. As you and I both remember, but for the audience's benefit, the American people were stunned when the Soviets launched a satellite before we did. And so Sputnik, a lot of Americans woke up to the news that there was this Russian satellite going around the Earth. And in response, Congress and the administration invested a huge amount in science and technology education, in NASA and in R&D. After the Vietnam War in the 80s and 90s, the United States looked inward, and we had a fight in Washington over industrial policy. And we sort of rested on our laurels. There was an ideological aversion amongst Republicans, principally, to the federal government investing in research, anything other than military research, because they didn't want the government picking winners and losers. Well, China has no such hesitancy at all. There really is no private sector in China. There's a close integration between the government and those companies that present themselves as being a private industry, but they all have some link into the government. And in the United States, we're beginning to see that not having some coordination between government, our national labs, research universities, and the private sector is a mistake. And so one of the things that's happened here is we've got a president and an administration that's clear-eyed about the challenge we face. and a newfound willingness on the part of my Republican colleagues to make these strategic investments in things like semiconductor chips, where we've got automobile plants that have had to close all over the Midwest because we are facing a critical supply chain vulnerability to semiconductor chips. The most cutting edge chips ought to be made here in America, and a sufficient supply of the sort of run of the mill chips that are essential to everything from cell phones to automobiles ought to be made in the United States. And that's a piece of the bill that we're going to be moving this coming week.
One more China-related question. One thing President Biden has been clear about is that he sees the competition with China in terms of democracy versus autocracy. And he has written, I believe we're in the middle of a historic and fundamental debate about the future direction of our world. We must prove that our model isn't a relic of history. You mentioned January 6th. Can we prove that democracy is functional, not only in terms of science and competence, but in terms of actual mechanics? Can we prove this while we have the kind of debate we're having at home over the big lie that the election was stolen?
Trudy, this is something that concerns me gravely. Our immediate past president refuses to accept the outcome of the election. And a significant percentage of the American people believe that the election of 2020 was fraudulent, was stolen. That hasn't happened in my lifetime. That we had a riot, a mob that overran the Capitol and interrupted the certification of the 2020 election. And yet when we came back into the chamber of the Senate, Mitch McConnell, Republican Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, gave the speech about how important it was for us to certify the election as free and fair and Joe Biden as the duly elected next president of the United States, despite there being a majority in the Republican caucus in the Senate that supported this critical piece of our electoral infrastructure, the framework of our democracy. There is a majority in the House that still refuses to accept it. There's folks at the state level in Arizona and elsewhere who are still indulging themselves in this fantasy that somehow there was a mistake in the tabulation of machines, or that somehow the 60 court cases, 60 different instances where courts, federal and state, considered President Trump's ill-considered and poorly based claims to election fraud. Every single one of those cases went against him. Despite all that, we've still got tens of millions of Americans who believe that President Trump is the duly elected president today. That's a problem. That's a fundamental problem. And we've got a real challenge in front of us in weaving back together the frayed strands of the American body politic, of the fabric of our social and political life. And the world is watching. Some of our closest allies who were somewhat embittered by the ways they were attacked by the Trump administration, by tariffs or demands for dramatically increased contributions to our shared security and defense, are holding their breath to see whether Trump runs again and is reelected, or someone just like him. So we have hard work to do, to respect each other, to listen to each other, to show that we can actually legislate in a way that delivers solutions that the average American cares about or notices or can feel. And we're still having fights over whether to wear a mask in a pandemic. So this is a pretty difficult, bitter, divided moment. That's why I work so hard, Trudy, at being bipartisan, at trying to demonstrate that we can legislate on everything from the civics education bill I've got with John Cornyn to some of the bills around working together to confront China in the human rights field that I've worked on with Republicans on the Foreign Relations Committee. We have to show that we can legislate. Otherwise, democracy isn't going to survive.
I wish we could talk about civic education, because I know your bill, which is so important with Senator Cornyn, is now being attacked as partisan. Yep. But we don't have time to go there. There's just very little time left. And I do have a question on Israel-Palestine, given what is going on. The president has been trying to pivot to Asia, but the Middle East never seems to leave the world alone or stay calm. The question here is, can you talk to us, Senator Coons, about the Israel-Palestine conflict and whether you
Sure.
think the president will seek to divest some of the funding that contributes to the lopsided muscle Israel uses against civilians in Gaza? And if you could just, talk about what do you think the way forward is to try to keep this from happening again, given that the infrastructure in Gaza had just been built up again after several years from the last set to. And there is a serious problem, not in any way to underestimate Gaza Hamas war crimes. But what is the Biden administration likely to do now to try to prevent more such violence?
Okay. I'll try to be brief, and I can see there's also a question about the special immigrant visas for Afghan translators, drivers, interpreters. So I'll try and answer both of these if I can before I go. Look, President Biden has impressed me by being relentlessly focused from the day he was elected to the day he was sworn in to today on addressing the domestic challenge of needing to get America vaccinated against this pandemic. And he's made huge progress, 200 million vaccines delivered. We're headed towards his goal of 70% of Americans vaccinated by the 4th of July. I'm noticing, restaurants opening, schools are going to be reopened in the fall. And the dramatic investment he's made in restoring and reopening our society through the American Rescue Plan that I supported is a big deal. He has tried not to be distracted by challenges overseas so that he can get us out of this pandemic. Yet he's had to answer the question, are we withdrawing from Afghanistan by May 1 or this year, or are we not? He's made a decision. He's bringing our troops home. We will have brought all of them home by late summer. And I recognize that we have a serious challenge in making sure that the tens of thousands of Afghans who have worked tirelessly alongside us and our troops are safe and have a pathway towards being home. I joined a bipartisan group of 20 senators in sending a letter to the president urging a focus on those particular Afghans. And I'll be working on that in the Foreign Relations Committee and the Appropriations Committee. And I will now answer the question about Israel-Palestine.
Before that, in that letter, it talked about considering an airlift. Would you and your fellow signatories consider an airlift to bring out thousands of interpreters and their families?
Yes. Senator Whitehouse, who's a colleague of mine, was the dependent of an American diplomat in Laos as Saigon fell and as Laos also fell, and has been particularly forceful and passionate about this topic, about preparing right now for what may happen in a year or two, or even only a few months. And we need to be prepared to get out of Afghanistan. Those Afghans and their dependents who risk their lives to serve and fight alongside us, we should be preparing for that, even if it doesn't happen for a couple of years.
Is the White House on board?
I don't speak for the White House. I only speak for me. And I have to wait until they make some public statement about it. But they certainly are aware of the widespread concern on the part of those of us in Congress about this issue. And I know they're well aware of this as a critical concern. But I also respect the fact that they don't want to create some needless sense of panic or alarm by announcing that they are preparing to evacuate those who have served alongside us. That would show a critical lack of confidence in the ability of the Afghan national forces to secure Kabul and defend the government. So recognize that there is a sensitivity there to being too public about this conversation that I understand. Look, the conflict that has just come to a probably temporary ceasefire in Israel and between Israelis and Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza is just the latest of a whole series of very difficult physical manifestations of the very deep divide and the very real challenges between Hamas, a terrorist organization that doesn't recognize Israel's right to exist and has rained rockets down on the civilians of Israel, and Israel, which, after having withdrawn its troops from Gaza years ago, has an increasingly tense and violent at times relationship with Hamas and the millions of Palestinians in Gaza who are suffering as a result. The West Bank is, of course, differently configured, being under the control of the Palestinian Authority. But there haven't been elections in the Palestinian Authority in either Gaza or the West Bank to give some legitimacy to the government of Mahmoud Abbas. And a majority of younger Palestinians no longer believe in a two-state solution or support the Palestinian Authority or Hamas. They are desperate for some other path. The majority of Israelis no longer believe in the two-state solution, and they see this merely as a zero-sum security fight. And that partly explains, I think, that the politics domestically within Israel for Prime Minister Netanyahu of continuing to go at Hamas in Gaza hard provided some unfortunate forward movement to this, despite the active engagement of Secretary Blinken and President Biden. The most effective way to engage with Israel, our close and trusted ally, is not by issuing tweets or by denouncing them on cable TV or sending aggressive letters and notices, but to provide appropriate engagement and pressure as an ally. And I think ultimately that succeeded in persuading Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Security Cabinet of Israel to stop the conflict in Gaza, and pressure by the Egyptians and others in the Gulf succeeded in pressuring Hamas to stop shooting rockets into Israel. But the underlying situation is in some ways more tense, more fraught, more difficult today than at any point in my life. I've long been a strong supporter of the two-state solution. The situation on the ground has gotten worse and worse from that perspective. And I look forward to working with leaders in the Biden administration and the president, as well as my colleagues on the Foreign Relations Committee, to assess what we can do going forward to create support for an environment where there may yet be some sustainable and just resolution to this decades-old conflict that, as you put it, Trudy, doesn't stay settled or quiet at all for long, and that may very well explode into active conflict again at any moment.
Just on that subject, last point, do you think that it is necessary for the Biden administration to consider taking a stronger position on Israeli settlements and evictions of Palestinians from their homes, which were the subjects, along with the Al-Aqsa Mosque, that set off this round?
Certainly. Look, I expect that President Biden will have different positions on a number of important issues in foreign policy than President Trump did. But as I just said a moment ago, I think the way to successfully engage with Israel, particularly when there is no government, when there's been 4 elections in a row without the successful formation of a government, and the prime minister and his government are essentially a holdover or a caretaker government until there is another election. I think the most appropriate way for President Biden to be clear about that difference in priority is privately, not publicly. I don't think you'll be seeing him give some aggressive speech, denouncing the prime minister and demanding a change in settlement policy. I would be stunned by that. I wouldn't expect it, and I frankly don't think it would be effective.
Thank you very much, Senator. It's been a great pleasure. And before I say goodbye to the audience, I just want to remind them that on June 18th, I will be doing my next web event for Inquirer Live on the subject of how to help Afghanistan's women, girls, and those who have worked with American forces and helped the United States, how to keep them from suffering from a potential Taliban takeover after we leave. That will be on June 18th. Thank you again, Senator, and I look forward to another time in the future.
Thank you, Trudy. Great being on with you.
Bye-bye.